Welcome back. This is day one of your respiratory system. So we just finished up talking about the circulatory system, and now we're going to talk about the respiratory system. But as we work through this unit, I want you to think about how is this connected to the circulatory system? Because remember, they have to work together to maintain homeostasis. But today's aim is how does the anatomy of the respiratory system allow it to function efficiently? So we're going to be talking about some structures that make up the respiratory system, and we're going to figure out how those structures help it work. But before we could do that, your do now today is what is the equation of cellular respiration? Okay, so go ahead and pause this video. Think way back to unit 3 and remind me, what is the equation for cellular respiration? All right, well, hopefully you remember that this happens in the mitochondria and your body has to take in glucose and oxygen. That oxygen comes in from the air that you breathe, the glucose comes in from the food that you eat, and both of those substances travel down to the mitochondria of your cells where they're used to produce ATP, energy, carbon dioxide, and water. And remember that carbon dioxide and water are exhaled as those waste products. All right. Before we go any further, I want to lay down some vocabulary words we need to know for the respiratory system. The first one you need to write down is your trachea. So the trachea is a large membranous tube reinforced by rings of cartilage that convey air to and from the lungs. You may have also heard this called the windpipe. So the trachea is going to run directly along the inside of your throat. And if you actually feel right here, you can feel that it kind of has some rings or tubes in it. And that is your trachea. So every time you breathe in air, air travels through that trachea. And eventually it's going to split into these two tubes right here in your chest. And those two tubes or branches are called the bronchi. That trachea splits into two. You've got two of these bronchi, one for each lung. And then eventually, if you zoom way into your lungs, you're going to find these structures called the alveoli. Now, this is not pronounced ravioli. The alveoli are air sacs in the lungs where the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide specifically takes place. Okay, and I'm going to show you a picture of what that looks like in just a second. All right, so go ahead and write these down on your paper. Now, on your paper, there's also a picture of where we find these structures inside the respiratory system. Now, I know a lot of you aren't going to be able to write on this diagram, but if you have the capability, go ahead and draw arrows pointing to where we find these structures. You have the word bank on your paper, and I want you to fill in where do we find these structures. All right, the first organ we need to know about the respiratory system is your mouth. So you can breathe in air through your mouth, and you can see that it connects into that trachea. Okay, and it connects actually with another structure that we'll talk about in just a second. But air travels in through your mouth and goes down into your trachea. And eventually it's going to split into one of these two branches that we call the bronchi. So again, there is a bronchi, a branch for for each one of your lungs, which is going to be these large air-filled spongy structures that expand and contract to let air in. Right now, back up at the top right, you see that the nasal passages also connect to that trachea. That is the reason why you're able to breathe in air either through your mouth or your nose, is because they both connect to the trachea and eventually the bronchi. All right, that leads us to, I'm going to erase that so you can see this cartilaginous or membranous structure known as the trachea. Again, this is that structure on your throat that has the little rings in it, those cartilage rings, also known as your windpipe. Okay. Now, eventually, I told you guys those bronchi are going to split even further into bronchioles, which are going to be these tiny little tree-like or kind of root-like extensions that extend throughout the entire lungs. So those bronchioles fill up your entire lungs. And then at the very edge of each of those bronchioles, there's going to be, let's do these in green, these tiny little circular sacs or structures at the very edge of these bronchioles, excuse me. Right, and those sac-like structures are known as the alveoli. And again, that is where gas exchange takes place, where oxygen and CO2 are actually exchanged. Okay, so I'm going to write down oxygen and CO2. Great. Now, we're going to keep learning more about this as we go through, but the very last, the very last structure you need to label on this diagram is known as the diaphragm, and that is going to be this muscular structure that's right underneath your rib cage, and that is going to expand and contract to physically push or pull air in and out of your lungs. And I'll show you guys what that looks like in the upcoming days, but that diaphragm is a muscular, I hate when this happens, it's blocking off my diagram. It's a muscular structure that actually allows air to fill up inside your lungs. Okay. All right. Now, this is just a gentle PSA. Please don't smoke, because here you'll see these healthy, pink, luscious lungs that fill up entirely with oxygen. Look how nice that is. They're huge. And then here's what your lungs look like if you smoke. They are literally black from smoke. They don't fill up as much. This lung is entirely collapsed. It's not even working. So when that happens, if you smoke for a long period of time, your lungs don't work as well, and they don't allow you to inhale as much oxygen, which is going to impact your entire body and your entire homeostasis. So treat your body well, don't smoke so you don't end up with lungs like these. Oof. All right, but now let's talk about the cell and its environment. So we've got a passage to read, as always. Annotate this passage as you go through, and then we're going to answer some questions about it. Okay, the smallest blood vessel in our bodies, that sounds pretty familiar. In fact, I believe those smallest blood vessels are known as the capillaries, are very close to every cell. So remember, they're so small that they can fit in between the tiny little crevices in between cells. And there is a small amount of space between the capillaries and the body cells, and this space is filled with fluid. In fact, each of our many cells is surrounded by liquid. This fluid that surrounds cells is made up of mostly water, with many substances dissolved in it. Since this is made up of mostly water, we could even call this an aqueous environment. The intercellular fluid is important in helping to maintain stable conditions inside each of our cells. Stable conditions inside, I might say that that is homeostasis. Okay. Many materials are exchanged between the cells and the fluid. In turn, materials may be exchanged between the fluid and the blood in the capillaries. All of this is done to maintain homeostasis in every cell and remain healthy. So in this diagram on your paper and on my screen, you can see that this right here is our capillary. We see that capillary is labeled right here. Is the capillary, okay? And it's carrying these red blood cells throughout that structure. Okay, and down here we see this intercellular fluid, that aqueous environment where we have that fluid, that watery fluid surrounding the capillaries and the cells. And I see something happening here. I'm seeing oxygen and nutrients go into those cells. So we see our cell right here. And I see carbon dioxide and wastes leaving the cells. Now, through what process are these small substances like oxygen and CO2 able to get into the cell? I almost told you the answer there. And exit the cell. Think about what process we know that allows those small molecules to go across the cell membrane. Okay, now that I've given you a nice hint, let's move to our questions. What is the name of the process that allows those substances to move from high to low concentrations so equilibrium is reached? Think back to Unit 4. That process is known as diffusion. So these molecules over here are going to diffuse into the cells and diffuse into the capillaries, because oxygen and nutrients here are going from high concentration in the capillaries to low concentration in the cells. And the opposite is true for CO2 and wastes. They are in high concentration in the cells and are going to flow into low concentrations in these capillaries. Okay, so again, with diffusion, molecules are moving from high to low concentration, and because of that, it does not require any energy. Okay, let's keep answering the rest of those questions. What allows cells to rid themselves of carbon dioxide once its concentration is too high in the cell? Again, that is going to be diffusion, because those molecules are moving from high to low concentration. But then where does the carbon dioxide go from the cell? So let's go back to our picture. If carbon dioxide right here is diffusing out of our cell, where is it going to? Well, it's going to be traveling to our capillaries. So it's moving into the capillaries and then will eventually move into the veins where it is removed from the body. But now, what allows oxygen to leave the capillaries and go into the cell? Let's go back to our picture. We've got a lot of moving going on. Again, we have a high concentration of oxygen in the capillaries. They're then going to move to a low concentration inside the cell. So again, that answer is going to be diffusion because again, molecules are moving from high to low concentration. Right? So diffusion is what allows those molecules to move in and out of the cells and the capillaries. All right, so using that information, go ahead and answer your exit ticket and submit this and your notes before 8:30 a.m. tomorrow morning. If you have any questions, send me a message on Remind and I'll get back to you. Other than that, have a wonderful day and I will see you guys tomorrow.